Hi, I'm Danielle Whitfield, NGV's Curator of Fashion and Textiles, and this is my co-host and colleague, Katie Somerville, NGV's Senior Curator of Fashion and Textiles. Welcome to our new virtual program series, Fashion Fridays, where we look at fashion in the NGV collection, as well as upcoming exhibitions with NGV curators, conservators, and special guests. Before we start, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to welcome any First Nations people who might be joining us today, and I pay my respect to those communities wherever they may be as well. Today, we are going to discuss some wonderful recent acquisitions by contemporary British designers. The UK has always been a leading centre for cutting-edge fashion and innovation, particularly since the late 20th century. And if you religiously read the Face magazine, as I did, then designers such as Vivienne Westwood, Alexander McQueen, John Galliano might be some of those names familiar to you. Yet, in the last decade, this has become even more apparent. Generational change, escalating concern for people and the planet, and a greater diversity of voices, gender concerns and design practices has really set a mandate for systemic change within the fashion industry. For many contemporary designers, fashion is now a vehicle for disruption and reinvention. From the textile to the garment, from the means or the scale of production, designers have been really rethinking the way that collections are made. Today, the designers we'll discuss, Maddie Boven, Samantha McCoach and Richard Malone, who hail from Yorkshire, Scotland and Ireland, all share a similar ethos. That is a commitment to sustainable and ethical practice and a respect for traditional craft skills. But as you will see shortly, each follow different pathways and have very different aesthetics. So, Katie, let's start by talking about Maddie Boven, who remarkably this year was the winner of both the 2021 International Woolmark Prize and also the Karl Lagerfeld Prize for Innovation. Can you introduce us?
My pleasure. Thanks, Danny. Quite a remarkable double award to be receiving so early in his career. So Maddie was actually born in York in the north of England in 1991, and in fact that's where his studio is still based. In 2015, he graduated from the famed Central St Martin's School of Art in London with a MA specialising in knitwear. And prior to that, he'd actually already done a BA in knitwear as well. So from the start, his work exhibited all that fabulous cacophony of sculptural knits, textures, wild handmade adornments, which went on to earn him subsequently an LVMH graduate prize, and he was nominated for emerging British designer talent, and went on to dress a number of well-known individuals, including Georgia May Jagger and Rita Ora, when she was presenting at NGV Fashion Awards. He's championed right from the very early days by famed stylist Katie Grand, and across his career has worked with a number of designers and design houses such as Coach, Marc Jacobs and Miu Miu.
And so the work we have on screen is a fantastic outfit, Look 26 from Maddie's Autumn-Winter 2018 collection. And it really has a lot of the designer's kind of key signatures in it, the dishevelled layering, the use of wool and tweeds, and the handmade accessories. Katie, perhaps you can talk us through some of the detail.
Sure. I'm just checking, Danny, the images are up on screen first. A minute.
Oh.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Sorry, my apologies.
That's all right. So, as you say, this fantastic example that we recently acquired from Autumn-Winter 2018, I think it's a really beautiful encapsulation of the fact that Boven has just long been an advocate for analogue living, typically making his pieces all by hand from his studio in his late grandmother's house in Yorkshire. He's an avowed pioneer for localism, designing and making garments outside the fashion capital system that exists and dominates. And for this collection, his inspiration came very locally as well, from the Yorkshire moors at dusk, as well as his own grandmother's beloved wardrobe of tweed suits. So houndstooth patterns are seen throughout the collection, and exaggerated tweed, sort of upscaled using chunky knit, is ever present. The pieces, though, aren't sort of finished and refined in the way that you might expect. They've got a tough, shredded, sort of asymmetrical aspect to them, so the texture is really foregrounded. Lots of askew angles and sort of almost sculptural aspects to the way that he creates these clothes. So it's a brilliant early example to have in the collection.
Yes, no, it's a great manifestation of that kind of personal inspiration, meeting the kind of ideas of Englishness in the nature of the textiles used, and obviously, as you say, that handcrafted element, which is very much about, as analog living. The next work, which we can see here, is from a slightly later collection, Look 13, from the In Uncertain Times, This Is a Sure Thing, presented in 2019, and I have to say that's a premonition if ever there was one. But this collection was inspired by Boven's research into folklore and myth, but also interestingly marked his first collaboration with the London store and manufacturer Liberty.
Yes, that's right. So Maddie was actually invited into the archive of Liberty in London, and he was able, as a consequence, to draw on their vast holdings of those incredibly iconic, delicate, largely floral prints that we all know, inevitably printed on crisp cotton, and the resulting works are this fantastic, quite idiosyncratic but very nostalgic take, but also still very much grounded in the politics of here and now. They are absolutely the antithesis, I guess, of what we come to think of as assembly line fast fashion, and the throwaway ethos that goes hand in hand with that. And his clothing, as a result, is really sort of akin to, the creation of an artwork, truly meticulously made by hand, very thought-provoking often, and laden with lots of extra meaning as well. He's, as we've already touched on, really passionate about local production, and the idea of craft is actually really central to these pieces. So it's sort of the power of hands-on creativity, and also the very, I suppose, current notion of gender ignoring dressing, so not dressing for one or the other. And family, interestingly, actually has always been central to his work. So originally taught by his mother and his grandmother to knit and crochet. And in actual fact, his mother, Plum Bovan, actually makes all the jewellery. She has her own jewellery label, and she makes all the jewellery for Maddie's collections, working inevitably with recycled materials. So the resulting works kind of really demonstrate his wonderful signature skill for reinventing the whole notion of English eccentricity, basically, sort of artfully dishevelled, with, aristocratic references, but a real sort of aesthetic that collides traditional technique with a very contemporary feel. All right, on to our next designer. For the label Kilt, we have Samantha McCoach, and Sam was born in Edinburgh in 1987, and after studying at Edinburgh College of Art and the Royal College of Art in London, she then spent 5 years working for Fred Perry, and then set up her own label, Kilt, in 2014. Early on, she was British Fashion Council Vogue Designer Fashion finalist in 2017, and also won the 2017-18 Woolmark Prize for the British Isles. And central to Samantha's design philosophy for her label is the very explicit preservation of traditional heritage techniques and innovation as a way of representing them in a new context for a contemporary audience. So, Danny, on that note of marrying the past and the future, can you tell us a little bit about the particular role that her grandmother played in inspiring her label?
Yes, well, this is a fascinating story. So Samantha's Italian-born granny, Carolina Miles, was a traditional kilt maker on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh's Old Town for over 40 years. And throughout Samantha's childhood and her teenage years, she would observe her grandmother, expertly tailoring kilts, trousers, and other kind of traditional staples from fine Scottish tartans. And one Christmas, her grandmother actually made her a black watch kilt, which is a traditional tartan. You'd be very familiar with it. It's the blue and the green, which she took to wearing as a sort of uniform to work with a T-shirt and boots. And it was after numerous requests and comments for sort of, similar item, like, where did you get that? Can I get one? That the seeds of the label were really sown. And the name Le Kilt is a homage to McCoach's heritage and her dedication to this very singular garment form, but also a playful nod to the legendary Soho Club of the 1980s, which was known for its sort of plaid and hunting lodge interiors. And I think it's this subcultural reference that really informs Samantha's particular aesthetic. She calls it a sort of punk spike edge. And the idea is really that by appropriating garments and innovating, you can sort of evolve evolve craft traditions, and that, the legacy of punk is about aspiring to have something different. And so it's in the kind of various iterations of this quilt, the unique iterations, that you have a new form of an old garment.
And I think, that is one of the interesting things. It's these kind of layers of handcrafted details also that really speaks to, what you might call slow fashion, and, how you make that relevant to a new audience. So I'd be particularly interested to know a bit more about, I know there are particular communities that she's collaborated with in terms of creating some of the knitworks.
Yeah, it's interesting you use the term slow fashion, because I'm going to start with the fibre itself. A lot of McCoach's knits are created using locally sourced wool, which is then hand knitted by groups of specialists. And one of the identifying aspects of this outfit here is the particular knitting technique that she's employed to create the vest. It's called the Sanker technique. It's from the village of the same name. The technique itself is over 300 years old, specific to the region, and really defined by this patchwork of intricate and gridded patterns that you can see on screen. Each piece is unique, and if you look closely at the two examples, you can see the differences between them. Interestingly, the vest in our collection has been knitted by a woman named Elma, and you can see it here acknowledged in the title. And it also features these wonderful applique woven wool patches. And I watched an interview recently with Samantha where she talked about how she really wanted to learn about how you make the fabric in order to be able to communicate its value to her customers. And so in 2018, she was inspired to buy a spinner and to learn to actually make the wool herself. And the woman that she tells this story where the woman who was teaching her said that all your emotions go into this process. And because it's so difficult, everything that you're feeling plays out in the wool and in the weave. So if you're having a great day, you get a nice fine thread. If you're having a terrible day and you're tense, it's really tight, which I think is a really great and nice perspective to the meaning of the value of labour when you think about, handmade items.
The short kilt in particular, which is what we can see in the work that we've acquired from Le Kilt, it's I suppose it's one of her signatures, and this one incorporates houndstooth with tartans called Modscott and the Black Douglas tartans into a sort of a composite design. In what ways would you say that McCoach is sort of innovating in the terms of the tradition of the kilt?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I guess it's in the kind of the composition, and as I mentioned before, in the kind of appropriation of a particular kind of tradition and then giving it a contemporary twist. So this can be seen in short versions of the kilts made with lurex thread or glitter thread, the integration of 3 different tartans into one kilt, the variation in pleating, from 1 or 2 pleats to all around pleats. And she's definitely playing with the form of this particular garment type. But I also guess I want to make mention that she is also very consciously interested in safeguarding the heritage of this particular craft. So she also works with charities who aim to preserve local skills associated with kilt making in particular areas. And I think, if we think more broadly about, the history of the kilt, they are always at this intersection of kind of the zeitgeist and tradition. If we think about how tartan has played a role in all kinds of subcultures, from punks to mods to grunge in the 1990s, and how each of those groups have adopted a particular look that kind of repositions tartan in some way. So it comes to have its own identity and versatility. And I think this is part of McCoach's remit, is to kind of give the kilt a place in an everyday wardrobe, something that becomes almost timeless, that is also about acknowledging that we're not in a disposable throwaway culture, that it is something that you keep in your wardrobe and you return to, and that you can wear time and time again. Now, before I go on about the next designer, I thought before I continue on Samantha, we should move on to the next designer, who is the wonderful Richard Malone. And he is, I guess, one of this generation's really leading voices for sustainable fashion practice. He launched his label in 2015 and only last year won the International Woolmark Prize for a fully biodegradable collection made with merino wool and natural dyes. And so, Katie, if you are happy to take over and tell us a little bit more about Richard.
Yes, of course. So Richard was born in Wexford in Ireland in 1990, so just a year before Maddie was born, and in fact graduated also from Central St Martin's School in London. He didn't focus in any particular area, but his BA was in women's wear generally. And very early on, with that graduating collection, he was awarded the prestigious LVMH Grand Prix scholarship to help support his label. And in a particular interest for us as a gallery, in 2017, he was then commissioned by New York's Museum of Modern Art to create a custom piece, a one-off piece for their exhibition, which was called Items is Fashion Modern. So he came to our notice and was someone that we were really keen to bring into the collection. And from the outset, his collections are really defined by strong contrasting colour, innovative tailoring, and a real reference to sculptural shapes. But underpinning all of those aesthetic elements is a real conscious commitment to sustainably sourced or recycled materials. Ethical labour is also on his list, along with just being really transparent about supply chains, circularity, and of course waste reduction. So he's also one of those people that takes a great inspiration sort of from his immediate environment. And, one of those sources of inspiration is the kind of irreverent, rebellious working class teens of his youth in Ireland. And I think one of my favourite quotes that kind of feeds into that is this notion that of his take on good taste. So I quote, "I cannot stand the idea of good taste, the idea that there's only either good or bad, one or the other. It's so arrogant and so short-sighted to overlook what might lie in between."
I really like that sentiment and that spirit of rebellion, because I think, what it does allude to is this giving yourself permission to break with convention and to offer something new in terms of whether that's a form, a sculptural form, or in terms of the materials being used or even the approach undertaken. And the outfit that you see here on screen is, a really wonderful work that we're very privileged to have from Richard's Autumn-Winter 2018 market collection. And I think it's a really great example of a designer thinking about every step in the production cycle and all of those different supply chains involved. So, Katie.
Back to me.
Back to you.
Well, I mean, I think Malone's really interesting too, because it strikes me when I first met him and spoke to him that this idea of sustainable practice is no longer something that for this generation that's sort of an add-on. It's something that he just felt was just intrinsically part of what his role as a designer in the here and now involved. But how that plays out in examples like the one that we've got on screen is that his fabrics are either sourced from within Britain or using recycled materials and collaborating with particular skilled communities of, in this case, female weavers in southern India. And these are women who he's worked with since his graduate collection. So it's about relationships and about building expertise. The trousers in this instance are made from hand-woven British wool using natural dyes, and the fabric used for the halter top and the long gloves and bag is actually made from recycled ocean plastic, and then this has been hand-woven and hand-fringed by the Ashandi weaving workshop that I mentioned before. And even the boots are actually made very consciously from British leather and by a shoemaker round the corner from Malone's studio in East London. So it really is about drawing in things as close as possible to his practice. And the references, again, this particular collection was presented in a very fun way, referencing the markets of his youth that, on the one hand, you might have bric-a-brac on the bench next to it. There might be, spare parts for a motorbike. So this kind of clashing of cultures and, references within the garments that almost look like aprons and headscarves. He's a designer who has a real reverence for women, strong women in his life, and yet another one whose granny played an important part in his early years, inspiring him. But there's something about this idea of honest and authentic spaces and how they have influenced resourcefulness and his own practice, and creating effectively more what he sees as a level playing field. But I think my favourite kind of quote that relates to this particular collection and this look was one he gave in dedication to this particular collection, which he dedicated to every heroine who ever knows how to hustle. So there's this idea of spirited women and how they might like to dress. But that's all we have time for today, I'm afraid, in terms of these new acquisitions. So I'll just hand to Danny to wrap up.
Thanks, Katie. And I should mention that this work is actually currently on display over at NGV Australia in the We Make the World exhibition. So I encourage everybody to go and have a look at it in the real, as we like to say, now that the world has opened up to us again. But I would like to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this program. For Katie and I, it's been a real pleasure to introduce you to some of these works in the NGV collection. We look forward to seeing you back in the gallery, and I hope you join us again for next Fashion Fridays program, where Katie and I will look at our summer exhibition Chanel and some recent acquisitions related to that. Thank you all.
Thank you.